everybody. Thanks for coming to UC Forum today. I would like to first make an announcement about Ruth Turney's service. Her service is going, the service for her memorial service will be 10 o'clock this Friday at Trinity Episcopalian. If you have any more questions about it, Paul is probably a good contact for it. So, that's Austin Turney's wife that passed away.
Which church are you talking about? Which Episcopal?
Trinity Episcopalian.
Downtown.
Paul, that's the one on Vermont Street, correct?
Vermont.
Yeah.
Vermont, yeah.
Right, 10th in Vermont.
Yeah.
And that's 10 o'clock this Friday. So, and then also, I would like to introduce JoAnn, who just walked away. This is JoAnn Farb. She is now actually, for this semester, our veggie lunch coordinator, but is very active in the community. She has worked at the Merck. She has taught classes at the Merck. She is a writer, an activist, a nutritionist, and very involved in what she's going to talk about. So I hope that you enjoy it. And here she is, here she is. So thank you for coming today, and this is JoAnn Farb. Thanks, JoAnn, for being here today.
You are welcome. Oops, did I mess this up? I did mess it up. I just wanted to, I thought I might raise it up a little bit if I could. Sorry. Okay. That worked? Good. Then I don't have to bend over. And I'll bring this over here. So, I used to work as a microbiologist for a global pharmaceutical company named Merck. And more recently, I taught nutrition education for our local natural foods co-op, also called the Merck. And these two experiences together have given me a unique perspective on what I have now come to believe is the fundamental challenge facing humanity. And it is my hope that in sharing my journey with you today, it will open your mind and your heart to something that I believe can help us together make a very powerful difference in the world. Now, before I begin to tell you my story, I'd like to sort of lay a foundation for you, beginning with this quote from James Madison. He says, "I believe there are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachments of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." So when I think about the major challenges facing us today, I've summarized them in these 5 things. And I'm curious to know, would you agree with me that these more or less address the major challenges facing humanity today? Worldwide violence and injustice, clean food and water for everybody, reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and addressing disease, morbidity, and mortality. Would you consider those pretty much the most important challenges?
Works for me.
Globally? Yeah. So what if something we've all been taught to do from our earliest days turned out was actually making all 5 of these worse? And furthermore, was completely unnecessary to having a good life, but most of us have never really even thought about it. Would you be willing to look into this further if I make a case to you? Will you at least pursue it? And what if the information you find out would enable you to save money and to even make it less likely that you would die from diabetes, heart disease, stroke, and cancer? Would you want to know more about it?
Yeah.
So my story begins with an incident that happened when I was a small child. A woman named Kitty Genovese was a waitress in New York City, walking home from work late one night in an urban area of New York where there were lots of people with their windows open, when she was attacked by a stranger. Now, many people heard her scream for help, but somehow over the course of half an hour time, before she was killed and screamed many times, somehow no help ever came. Now, this had a profound effect on the whole country as people asked, who are we as a people that something like this could have taken place and no help came for her? For me, it had a powerful effect too, as I grew up hearing adults talk about this incident many times in my childhood. And I vowed that if I was ever in a position where I was aware of an injustice happening, and my speaking up without putting myself in danger might be able to make a difference, I wanted to always be a person who would be willing to do that. The second incident that had a profound effect on me was when I was about 8 years old and I learned about the Holocaust. Now, as an 8-year-old child, the world was very black and white to me. And my understanding of people, there were good people and there were bad people. The Nazis were definitely bad people. But there was something I learned about the Holocaust that challenged that very simplistic notion of who's good and who's bad. And it was this, that many of the prison guards who were known to have carried out some of the most horrific acts of violence against children and even babies, they were known to go home each day and by all accounts were normal husbands and fathers. And I couldn't wrap my brain around this. How could that be? And it stuck with me all this time because it did challenge what was otherwise my view of the world. Now, I was not the only one trying to make sense of the Holocaust. A Yale psychology professor named Stanley Milgram is one of the better known for some of the experiments that he did. And one in particular sought to understand what percent of just average people, when an authority figure was pushing them to do something that they believed might cause harm to others, people that they didn't really know, what percent, even as they became aware of that, would still be willing to push the button and cause harm?
A lot of them.
It turned out, in the first experiments he did, it was over 65% that were willing to do that. Now, they repeated the experiments in different venues and different places. That number never went much below 50%, which tells us that about half of us are capable of behaving in ways that are contrary to our own values when the environmental conditions are just right. It also tells us that the culture may make a difference in this because the amount did vary from a little below 50 to 65. So there are probably cultural values and practices that could mitigate this number too. Now, before I can share with you incident number 3, you need to know a little bit more about me. I was a huge animal lover as a child. I was the kid in the neighborhood that everybody brought orphaned and injured squirrels and birds and raccoons to, and I took care of them. And I actually successfully rehabilitated and released a number of animals before I was even 18. I also had been a compulsive overeater from my earliest days. I saw myself as the person with the least willpower of anybody I knew. I would always eat until I was sick and could never stop myself, over and over. And 2 of my favorite foods were barbecued ribs and steak soup. Now, just before I became a teenager, my parents became aware of how the meat that they were buying at the store had been injected and fed so many different toxic chemicals and hormones and antibiotics. They wanted better meat. This was a long time ago. There was no grocery store in the country you could walk into and buy organic meat. So they decided to get a farm in the Ozarks and put a herd of cattle on it so that we could have meat that wasn't adulterated. And I used to go down on the farm weekends with my father, and I'd watch the cows. And I noticed that the mamas and the babies had such a strong bond and attachment. It was very profound. And I felt pretty connected to them. Whoops. And I remember sitting down to dinner one night and somebody announcing, "Oh, this steak, this is the first steak from our cows." And it hit me. I mean, I had always known that meat came from animals at some level, but I had never thought about it in terms of an animal I might love being killed so I could eat meat. And I stopped eating it right then, and I said, I am never eating a cow again. And I didn't. Now, I made this decision without even contemplating the fact that I was like this hugely food-addicted person with no willpower. And so I had to get creative in how I was going to make this happen. And I actually think it was love that inspired me. Love was stronger than my addictions in this case. But my creativity kicked in, and I thought about the fact that when I saw, dead skunks and opossums and squirrels on the road, I didn't salivate. I didn't think about how good those would be to eat. And really, there wasn't that much difference. It was still dead animal flesh, whether it was the steak or the roadkill. And so I just made that connection in my mind every time I thought about eating meat or saw somebody eating it. No problem. I had no more desire for it. So then I get to college, I'm studying microbiology. The idea of survival of the fittest kind of becomes, a moral framework for me, and it justifies all kinds of things. And I'm getting a pretty intense education that is teaching me to be desensitized as well through lots and lots of dissections on animals. And then I need to make money, and I hear about a job that is looking for somebody to do research on rats. And it's a pretty sophisticated sounding research project, and lots of people are applying for it. And I'm really thrilled when I am selected over lots of other students who I consider much better students than myself. I get this job, I get into it, without going into too much detail, I start to realize that the experimental design is flawed, and that the data we're getting from this is going to be completely meaningless. And we are torturing rats, cutting the tips of their tails off to draw blood multiple times a day. We are starving them for 2 or 3 days at a time to try to get them to eat the things we want them to eat that they won't eat. And one day I walk in and the rats are just doing this in their cage when I walk in, each in their own individual cage. And it's clear I am participating in torturing these animals, and I've come to realize the experimental design is so flawed the data will have absolutely no value. So I head into the professor whose lab it is, and I tell him, I just realized, this isn't even going to be useful data. Why are we doing this? And I explain it all to him, and he looks at me and he says, "You're absolutely right," he said, "and I know that too. But if I don't use up this grant money before the end of the year, I won't get as much next year. So just go ahead and do it anyway. It doesn't matter that we won't have good data to publish." So I'm proud to say I actually quit that job. And it also changed my thinking. I didn't really know, I had no experience with lab animal research before that time, and I realized that was just one lab. But I actually had lots of experiences there with lots of people. And it led me to develop this conclusion at that time about lab animal research, that anybody capable of doing research, and even assuming it might sometimes be scientifically valid research, that anybody capable of doing that must be somebody who's got a very hard heart or doesn't care about animals, because nobody who really cared would be able to do this. That's what I developed in my mind. That's my thought, but I don't think about it too much more. I move on. I don't globalize this in any way. It's just kind of there. The other thing that happened while I was in college is I started to make connections about how the industry, various industries, influence the values and perspective of students. And we have so many examples of this. You've got forestry companies teaching about sustainable forest management and perpetuating the idea that you can cut down an old-growth forest and put in a monoculture of trees and they're equivalently the same, right? You've got that. That's the type of stuff that is being taught and influencing students. It's happening with biotechnology right now. I've got a class up at Cornell College, for example, claimed to be a debate on biotech. All 3 professors teaching it were getting paid by Monsanto in side projects. So these are the kinds of things that are going on, and I'm starting to make some connections. And the best example of this, actually, is the dairy industry. And nobody even thinks about this because every single one of us has grown up in a time period where the dairy industry has had a monopoly on teaching nutrition education in the public schools. From our earliest ages, all the free curriculum materials provided to teachers promoted the dairy industry's perspective. And much of what they said in there and passed off as scientific fact, we hadn't even done the science yet to know if that was factually true. Since that time, we've got a lot of science now. And let me just share with you a few things. But it's so hard for people to appreciate this now because we've all been indoctrinated. And the real science actually contradicts what we all believe because we've learned it for so long. But for example, they talk about osteoporosis being prevented with dairy. In fact, the countries in the world with the highest rates of osteoporosis have the highest per capita consumption of dairy products. So dairy is actually not protective for osteoporosis, and there's many mechanisms that can explain this as well. We also know that in children newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, they tend to have extraordinarily high levels of an antibody to a protein found in milk that cross-reacts with the cells of the pancreas in something called biological mimicry, destroys the pancreas. And there is other research suggesting that in those genetically predisposed to type 1 diabetes, they never are exposed to cow's milk, they might never get diabetes. They also don't tell you that men with prostate cancer can lower their PSA and sometimes halt the progression of the disease by going completely dairy-free. And that we have published studies showing that most cases of asthma, ear infections, and arthritis all improve when people go completely dairy and sometimes completely animal protein free. So those are just examples of the ways that this educational system can be biased. So I was back in school after college working on my master's when I found out about a job that Merck had that sounded like I was qualified for, and it had some incredible benefits and company car and travel and training and vacations in nice places for sales meetings and fantastic money, retirement benefits, all of that. And so I decided rather than going further in debt on my student loans, it might be nice to make some money. And I applied for this job with hundreds of other people. It got narrowed down to just a few of us through several rounds of interviews. The lower level management settled on me for the position. Then I got flown to company headquarters for a full day of interviews with the top brass who would decide if I actually got hired or not. And the lower level management that really, they wanted me by this time, they'd chosen me from everybody, they were now coaching me through the interview process. And the thing they told me was, they said, we love how honest you have been and that you've just been yourself through this. And they said, don't do anything different. As you continue through, just be honest, answer everything as honestly as you can, and we think you'll get the job, no problem. So I go into the final interviews with this, and it was true. I felt I had been very honest and genuine. So it was really great to hear that who I was and what I was putting out there was what they wanted as well. As I went through that full day of interviews, I found out it was really 2 jobs in one. Half my job, it was very unique in this way. I would be working in the marketing department. The other half, I would be in the scientific department. So I got to see the company in probably a little bit more holistic way than most people at my level entering a company like this would have any clue about. And so I've gone through this whole day of interviews. I'm in front of this big, very intimidating, dark-haired man. The final round of interviews, we've been talking for 2 hours, and he gets to the final interview question. And here's what he asked me. He says, so, tell me what you think about animal rights. Now this was the early 1990s, in fact it was 1990. I had never heard of PETA at that point. I didn't even know really what animal rights was. And I didn't know that I didn't know what it was. So I thought it must mean animal lover. And I thought, well, gosh, if, I remembered my lab experience, and yeah, I thought that was wrong. That must make me for animal rights. But I didn't really know, and it was clear from the way he asked the question that if I answered this wrong, I was not going to get the job. And I'm remembering, be honest, and what do I say? So for the longest time, I'm staring across the table at this man, looking into his eyes. My brain is in overdrive. How do I answer it? What do I say? How do I answer it? What should I say? And I'm not saying anything. I am just staring into his eyes, and there's a long silence. Finally, after a very long silence, he breaks the silence, and he says, never mind. You don't need to answer that question. Just answer this. Do you think that you will be able to do this job? And I was able to say, yes, I will. Because I was going to be going into confinement, pig, and poultry operations. I was going to be in lab animal testing facilities. I was going to be in pharmaceutical manufacturing plants. So the first thing I learned is I actually get into the job, and I'm meeting lots of caretakers, and I'm getting to know them personally. I'm taking them out after work. I'm building relationships with them. I discover that I was actually wrong to assume that animal caretakers were these hard-hearted people who didn't care about animals. Not all of them, but many of them, in fact, had been drawn into this work because they were animal lovers, and they wanted a career that allowed them to be with animals. Once they figured out that they were participating in things that were causing pain and suffering to animals, then they justified it by saying, it's better that someone like me who at least cares is doing this work, because I can make it hurt them the least than if somebody who just doesn't even care about them at all is doing these procedures and doing these things. And that's kind of how they kept themselves going. But something then, and the other thing I noticed was that they were very sensitive to the perception that the world might think, as I used to think about them, that they were these evil, dark people, that they could do what they were doing. And in fact, I would notice on the walls all these posters that said things like, lab animals save lives. And one of the most memorable, I couldn't find it for this, so I put this picture up, was one that showed a beautiful little girl in a hospital bed with a thermometer in her mouth and the hospital equipment around her and stuffed animals all around her head. And the caption said, the animals that really saved this little girl's life aren't in this picture. And it was heart-wrenching. And as I thought about that, I was like, well, yeah, of course, save a child's life, yeah, that makes sense. And that's what I'm thinking at the time. But then, all of a sudden, I realized, wait a minute. I had been in over 90% of the facilities in the Kansas, Missouri, Nebraska, and Iowa area that were doing research with animals. And I knew what they were doing. I had seen it all. And what I knew was that the research they were doing in most cases had absolutely nothing to do with helping human health. These were companies called animal health companies, like Boehringer Ingelheim, SmithKline Beecham, Santa Fe Animal Health. And they are engaged in trying to figure out what the next opportunistic pathogen of overcrowded, enormously stressed farm animals is going to be the first to market with it, so that they can scare all the farmers into using their products so they won't have huge economic losses. That's what was really going on. And yet they were all justifying what they were doing because lab animal research could save human lives, was what these posters were saying. But then a really key moment for me came when I was touring one day a chicken hatchery. Now this is an industrial operation that hatches chickens, and they have these big walk-in incubators that on any given day all the eggs in that incubator are supposed to hatch. And they're in these carts, and they get wheeled down the hall to what looks like a cafeteria-style window, and there's a couple men whose job it is to take the newly hatched chicks off and put them on the conveyor belt where they get their first round of vaccinations. And as I was watching these men work, the belt would get overcrowded, and they had to stop working, and they would smoke cigarettes and tell jokes. And while I was watching them through the window, I saw one little chick come up to the edge and jump off and fall to the ground. And I couldn't see him all the way to the ground, but I knew chicks are light. They don't get hurt falling 5 feet to the floor. When I got around the other side, and I kept wondering, why doesn't somebody bend down and pick that chick up? Nobody's paying attention. And I go around on the other side, and that's when I could see the floor. And I see that there are dozens of chicks on the floor. Some of them are still running around. But most of them had gotten run over by the next round of carts. They were still alive, stuck by their own blood and guts to the floor. And I thought, why doesn't somebody at least just step on them? Put them out of their misery. Or why don't they pick up the ones that fall so they're at least being fully utilized? And as I watched them there, not noticing this, and I'm privately horrified at what I'm seeing, I'm flashing back to other things that I know from my past, where humans have turned a similar blind eye to something horrific happening right in front of them. And I'm seeing it. I'm seeing it with my own eyes. So as I started to connect all of this, and there was lots more I saw, I'm going to spare you the details of today, I realized that it wasn't just that these institutions and these workers were doing bad things. I realized they were doing it for me. It was my choices at the grocery store, at the restaurant, when I sat down with people and ate the food that was offered to me. That's what was driving all this. They were just filling a need.